What does Nietzschean mean? Well, on its face, it means related to the worldview of 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Sure, but another definition is someone who supports the philosophy of Nietzsche, a Nietzschean. Is Frank Costello from Martin Scorsese's 2006 film The Departed a Nietzschean? Even if he has never cracked open Beyond Good and Evil or The Antichrist, does he exhibit the qualities of a Nietzschean? Or does he exhibit the qualities people associate with Nietzsche, but are actually misconceptions about the works of the famous German philosopher? Well, in the film, Frank Costello is a crime boss in the city of Boston. He plants a man named Colin Sullivan in the police department to be his mole. Meanwhile, the police plant Billy Costigan in Costello's mob to be their mole. A lot of the critics focus on the twists and turns of the plot, and that's fine, but perhaps more fascinating is Costello's philosophy. At the beginning of the film, Costello says that when he was young, the people had the church. It told them what to do, when to pray, when to kneel. Costello believes that he sees through all of that, and so did Nietzsche. Nietzsche asked, what makes a culture great? How do we maximize this greatness? To Nietzsche, in his writings on the ancient Greeks, declared that the health of a culture, greatness, was defined by its art, intellectualism, or political military power. Nietzsche was perhaps the most outspoken critic of Judaism and Christianity in his day. He believed that Christianity was injurious to the greatness of culture, the greatness of power, what he considered the health of culture. He believed Christianity had literally made Western civilization sick. Similarly, Costello believed that following the church was the wrong path, and that doing so made people weak. Nietzsche and Costello deplore weakness. Nietzsche had a lot to say, and so does Costello. The mob boss's monologue does go on, doesn't it? Anyway, Nietzsche asked that we compare the morality of those in power, the aristocrats, with those who are not in power, the slaves. Nietzsche meant both literal slaves, but also anyone who is oppressed. This is Nietzsche's view of master and slave moralities. Masters valued, above all, power and devalued the slaves, the oppressed. Conversely, the oppressed valued compassion for themselves and believed too much power, in this case held by their oppressors, was wrong. It's a crisscross of values. The oppressed understandably saw a lack of compassion in the aristocrats and called this lack of compassion evil. To Nietzsche, the oppressed invented God to explain their own suffering and to believe there will be something more, an afterlife, to make all of this suffering bearable. Nietzsche not only rejected God, but rejected the slave's concept of value. Nietzsche despised what he considered weakness. Frankly, he would not shut up about it, and the slaves, both being weak and theistic, represented this. Costello seems to believe in this too. He references African Americans in his monologue, although he uses the slur, and derides them for not realizing that if they want something out of life, they've got to take it. Costello rejects the pleas of oppressed people in America and finds them unsatisfactory because he has no sympathy for those who he believes choose to be oppressed. Nietzsche believed slaves, or really anyone who is oppressed, are cowards because a strong person would sooner die fighting back against the master. Those who don't do that become slaves, he believed. Nietzsche rejected the belief of the oppressed that their weakness was a virtue. A Nietzschean would see the biblical quote, "Blessed are the meek," as abhorrent. Nietzsche believed this slave morality was invented by Jews because what would a modern German philosopher be without some antisemitism, right? Nietzsche also believed Christianity was basically a jacked-up version of Judaism, the form in which it now spread. The Roman Empire, a powerful cultural entity to Nietzsche, adopted Christianity and ruined culture for everyone because Christianity is slave morality. The masters, meaning the Romans, chose slave morality, and Nietzsche hated this. He wanted culture to fight back and become powerful. He wanted to make Western civilization great again. When Costello encounters men and women of the church, he also remarks on their poor choices. A nun is hinted at being Costello's former lover before she took her vows. Costello sees her newfound chastity not as strength, but as a weakness. He has no respect for her. Most people in the 19th century, and indeed now in the 21st century, still identify as believers or religious in some way, but Nietzsche saw that religion was becoming less of a focus in everyday life. People don't often choose their professions or spouses based on advice from their priest. These decisions are separate from that of religion. Nietzsche wrote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Human beings, he said, invented God because of the aforementioned slave-master relationship, and we are now in the process of stripping the power of the concept of God from our lives. Even though Nietzsche was an atheist, he didn't necessarily believe this death of God in society was definitely a positive. Because in order for this to be beneficial to society, we would need to replace the values of God with new values. But what would these values be? Well, the values that Frank Costello seems to hold dear: pride, desire, and power. He is prideful. He remarks that he does not really need the money, especially at his age, but he does what he does because it makes himself feel powerful. He has lustful desires, and he notes that he doesn't actually need sex at his age either. He only desires it, perhaps as status. And power, well, that is what he wants most of all. These are all classical virtues that men like Aristotle talked about. If Christians thought of these things as sins, and Christianity is wrong to Nietzsche, then he concluded that these problematic virtues might be good. It's not as black and white as that, though. See, belief in God, Nietzsche said, makes us ashamed of our strongest instincts, and if belief in God is wrong, then following our strongest instincts must be right. If slave morality is wrong, then master morality is correct. The desire for power is not immoral, he thought. Reality is a will or urge to create forms that are powerful, what Nietzsche called the will to power. Everything living seeks to express its strength. Now, Nietzsche did literally say that an act of torture, rape, or murder is not intrinsically wrong, but he said this because nature, the only reality to him, is intrinsically torturous, rapacious, and murderous. Nietzsche did not necessarily recommend cruelty. His influence might not have been so great had he been so overt, but he claimed that a morality's value is how it helps or hinders a culture's greatness, and the effect it has on the actor, not the person who is affected by the act. So, while it is true that Nietzschean morality does not recommend cruelty, Nietzschean morality does seem to excuse it in some cases. He believed that all creatures both do and should seek the maximal expression of their power. Different types of people, Nietzsche said, need different types of morality. A warrior needs a war, for example. Nietzsche considered himself a free spirit and therefore immune to many of the rules of society, and others are immune to different rules, etc. He believed that society must have rules, yes, but those rules are more important for ordinary people. People who get up in the morning to go to work and then sleep, the metronomes of the slow spirit, he called them. Nietzsche wanted some people to become the exception, but not the rule. Costello sees himself as an exception. He is living by his own morality, but he is also a hypocrite. He admonishes rats, but he has a rat inside the Boston Police Department, and he himself is an FBI informant. Like Nietzsche, Costello finds that conventional morality is hollow, but Costello is just basically a nihilist. We might admire him for calling into question the hypocrisy of a priest who molested a child, but he has no real morals himself. He values nothing. Even in the end, he lies to Sullivan about how much he values him, but Sullivan knows it's all a lie and kills him. Costello valued nothing. Nihilism is the rejection of values. Nietzsche was not a true nihilist because he believed some things do have value. It's just that things he believed have value are only strength and health of culture. Nietzsche believed Judaism and Christianity were actually nihilistic because they had the wrong values and devalued what he thought was important, but that's not nihilism either. Nihilism is the belief in no value, none at all. Christianity affixes inherent values to both things and ideas, which is in direct opposition to what nihilism actually has come to mean. So when people say Nietzsche was not a nihilist, that is true in that whenever he wrote about nihilism, he called it a great crisis and not something to be held dear. But because he considered nihilism to be something completely different, the sickness of culture due to what he believed was slave morality, and may as well have used a different word altogether, this information is not relevant in determining whether or not Nietzsche or his works are nihilistic or promote nihilism under the more standard definition. I hope that clears that up, but if I know Nietzsche disciples and nihilists, it definitely won't. Nietzsche wrote, "The demand of one morality for all is detrimental to the higher men." This hierarchy, this notion of different rules for different men, whether Nietzsche meant it one way or another, leads to some dangerous places. Let's not dance around this. Nietzsche's work was popular among fascists, and frankly, some of that continues to this day. Historically, Mussolini found Nietzschean philosophy very attractive, as did Hitler. Nazis brought up the concept of the Nietzschean Übermensch as justification for their alleged superiority, though that is a bit of a bastardization of the concept. Costello, believing himself to be above all others and able to see the truth in all things, may have thought of himself that way too. Nietzsche presented the Übermensch as the creator of new values. An Übermensch is the solution to the problem of the death of God and nihilism. If the Übermensch acts to create new values within the moral vacuum of nihilism, there is nothing that this creative act would not justify. Because individuality is put on such a pedestal, modern Nietzschean thinkers sometimes rank individuality above all. If you have ever heard anyone yell about how the collectivists are secretly working towards a weaker Western culture, you will recognize this. Anyway, in the film, Costello tells the young Sullivan, "Growing up, you are told that you could be a cop or a criminal, but when facing a loaded gun, what is the difference?" Costello definitely does not follow all of the tenets of Nietzsche's philosophy, that's true, and this might make one immediately declare him not to be a Nietzschean after all. However, that does not take into account how well people follow their religious beliefs. For example, the average Christian probably misunderstands a thing or two about the Bible, doesn't follow every last commandment perfectly, and skips church here and there. Costello is as Nietzschean as the average Christian is, well, Christian. Nietzsche probably would not consider Costello an Übermensch, though. The crime boss is far too nihilistic in the traditional sense of that word, and I might even agree. He has no interest in value. But it's hard to find any real right and wrong in the works of a philosopher far more concerned with greatness. Nietzsche said, "Nothing is true. Everything is permitted." Over a century later, philosophy professor Lawrence Cahoon countered, "Of course, all of this raises the question of how we can interpret his own claims as true if he's going to undermine the value of truth." Good point, Professor. Nietzsche's work is far more challenging to interpret than the average philosopher due to his baffling writing style, but what is not challenging is determining what people, from commoner to politician, have taken away from his writings. Whether you agree with Nietzsche's assertions or not, it hasn't all been good. Frankly, the world is full of Costellos. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.